Hello all, and welcome to the first session in our IHR summer series on adaptation, resiliency, and care. Thank you for joining the conversation today. Thank you for taking the time out of your day today for our conversation. We think it's going to be fantastic and interactive. Today's conversation is about teaching online in a pandemic, and we are collectively experiencing two pandemics simultaneously, coronavirus and the continuing violence against Black people in this nation. When our IHR team first thought of this series, it was late March. We were just beginning to understand the severity of COVID, and we knew that the humanities, and especially care, would be important to building networks of mutual support, and that feels all the more vital now for us, but especially for our students. And so our speakers today were asked to consider a list of questions in light of their experiences with the rapid adaptation to teaching online that happened this spring semester and reflect back on those experiences. Those questions are, and I'm just gonna read them aloud. How do we, as mentors and teachers, attend to the trauma being experienced by our students and communities? How do we create cohesion or a sense of chemistry and vibrancy in a virtual classroom? What barriers to access have you or your students encountered, and what mitigates them? What is and isn't possible in a virtual environment, and how do we adapt the tools we have at hand to create meaningful learning outcomes? And what doesn't work in a virtual classroom? This is my favorite question. What was your biggest fail? Our speakers today will be giving brief presentations, and then we're going to be opening up to questions. And those questions can be submitted at any time in any of our live streams that's on Facebook Live and on YouTube. One of our moderators will then relay that to our panel. Thank you to our moderators today. I want to especially thank Selena Asuna, our IHR coordinator at the Institute for Humanities Research at ASU, and Lauren Whitby, who's our Institute for Humanities Research Communication Specialist. This event would not be possible without them, and also the work of Joseph Carter, who is running our streams today. So thank you so much for the staff that make this possible and make everything at ASU possible. I'm going to introduce our speakers as they present today, and I'm so happy that they were all able to join us. Thank you for taking the time out of your day and your teaching prep maybe to join us today. So first will be Anna Hedberg-Olaninia, who is an assistant professor of comparative literature and media studies at the School of International Letters and Cultures at ASU. Her teaching and research interests include 20th century Russian literature and cinema, international film history, and film theory with an emphasis on media archaeology, spectatorship, and performance. Her book, Psychomotor Aesthetics, Movement and Affect in Modern Literature and Film, was published by Oxford University Press this year, 2020. It traces the ways in which early film directors, actors, and performance theorists used the psychological ideas of their time to conceptualize expressive movement and transference of emotion. And so now I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Anna. Thank you.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yes, thank you so much, Liz. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. I think it's very timely. So as a humanities scholar, my role is to build frameworks for a rigorous, imaginative, and culturally sensitive analysis of literature and cinema. Frameworks that bring my students together and inspire them to think deeply about the worldviews that are encoded in works of art, about the values and beliefs that are negotiated in diverse cultural practices. So whether we are reading a novel by Svetlana Alexievich, or we watch a film by Spike Lee, or we analyze murals or graffiti art, we witness the author's powerful social interventions, their efforts to confront injustice, their anguish, their passion, their sense of the sublime. The intellectual work that goes into analyzing these unique voices opens one's horizons, teaches one's compassion and tolerance. Through classroom debates, research papers, creative projects, my students sharpen their critical reasoning. They learn the importance of independent fact-checking, and they polish their skills of argumentative writing. In short, college humanities courses are a place of discovery and self-discovery, a place where one matures as an individual. And in my classes, I aspire to nourish that stimulating and inclusive atmosphere that encourages this personal growth and maturity. Right now, we are in the middle of a global health crisis. And as it is increasingly apparent, it is also a social crisis which exposes the disparities of our time and the fragility of our safety networks. And at this time, we need the humanities more than ever. We need that compassion, that maturity, that readiness to stand up for a more just world. And we need those skills of critical reasoning and independent fact-checking to resist manipulation and to be able to tell right from wrong. When ASU switched to the online mode, I found myself relying on Zoom and Canvas to deliver my classes. This turned out to be a fantastic platform, and I really invested a lot of time in educating myself about various opportunities that they offer, such as breakout rooms, peer review feedback on papers, recording video and voice presentations by students, and encouraging people to post comments and so on and so forth. Yet I was always very anxious about whether this online modality would be able to recreate that spirit of inclusion and spontaneity and rigor that I so painstakingly cultivated in my on-ground classes. I was profoundly moved by my students' eagerness to come back to class and learn, to keep digging deeper into those films and texts that we were analyzing. And in fact, I found that our classroom discussions became much more intense and more focused online. Several students shared with me how much they were waiting to talk to their peers in the chat and in the breakout room on Zoom because of the social isolation and uncertainty that they were experiencing. So coming back to class, even if in the virtual form, helped them to regain their sense of purpose, their sense of structure. There is no question about the fact that the pandemic disrupted everyone's lives. Some students had to take on full-time care of their siblings and their relatives. They struggled to find time and space to keep up with the class because of this redoubled duties. Others lost their jobs and were fearing how they would be able to keep paying rent. Some students did not have access to a good computer and fast internet to take full advantage of virtual learning. For many students, the only private place that they have is literally their bed or a corner of their kitchen table in a room shared with roommates and siblings who are also might be trying to connect to their own virtual classes at the same time. These are all very real, very practical challenges. They are obstacles to productive learning. But in addition to those, there is also, of course, the psychological toll, anxiety, uncertainty, loneliness. In my classes, we shared our concerns and challenges and with each other, and I felt that helped to create some camaraderie and some transparency and inclusivity. I encouraged my students to draw parallels about between their insights about the films and critical readings that we were doing and the unfolding news and their own perspective. And I was moved to see how much the students are inspired by each other and how they feed off each other's points. In my graduate seminar on cultural theory, one of the students chose to write a final paper on the use of the patriotic and nationalistic rhetoric in the media coverage of the pandemic. And in my undergraduate class on film acting, one of the students asked if he could play an electric guitar solo during the last 5 minutes of the final class as a way of thanking his peers for being there for him and being there for each other, and also as a way of celebrating graduating seniors. So this kind of really heartwarming moments really made me very proud and made me want to invest as much time as possible in supporting our students and to creating these opportunities for them where they can grow and blossom and become those professional individuals that they decided to be when they embarked on the college career. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I wrote so many notes for that. And one of the things that I wrote down twice because it was so important is that we need the humanities now for a more just world. And thank you also for sharing those moments of joy and like shared joy in classes. I'm now going to pass the virtual mic to Cynthia Roses-Thema. She has 9 years of experience teaching totally online in the School of Film, Dance, and Theater. The courses she has designed for the dance program encompass Tensegreity, physical thinking through walking, and writing the creative body. She has just completed her 4th book, Floating Bones, A Dancer's Tensegretic Body as Teacher. With a PhD in Rhetoric and Composition, she brings her professional experience of being a principal ballerina, an entrepreneur, and a journalist to her instruction. Thank you so much for joining us, Cynthia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I really am pleased. I've always looked at the moving body as a text, and it's wonderful to be able to talk about the embodied perspective and embodiment from the perspective of a mover in this environment. Having taught, so what I have to offer today is really the crux of what has occurred for me in the past 9 years of teaching totally online. I've made mistakes, I've done things wrong, I've learned things, and along the way, the main thing, if I could boil it down to one thing, is that face-to-face does not equal online. That's really important to understand because as instructors, when you're faced with 3 days and all of a sudden you have to go online, you bring with you all the tools, expectations, assumptions, and skill sets of face-to-face into this online environment. And it is not equal to face-to-face. And there are 3 ways in which I found it's not equal. The first is power dynamics. We love active pedagogy, constructivist pedagogy. We want the students to be involved and engaged in their work. But the power dynamics shift. The student has to come. There is an initial impetus. The student has to move themselves to be with you. There is a difference in power dynamics. When you stand in a face-to-face class, you know immediately when you've said too much, when they've tuned off, what's going on, who's talking to you. You cannot make those in the moment understandings in the online world. And sometimes that becomes problematic because as an instructor, when you using Zoom, you can see the students and you see that they're looking at their phone, you think, oh my goodness. And it may not be anything. It may not, I have learned to just let those things dissolve. And so the power dynamics shift. And sometimes for faculty, that can be difficult and a barrier. The second thing is an orientation issue for both you and the students, orienting to the screen when your physical environment is different, when there are other things happening, when you can see out the window, when you see the trees blowing, when you hear something going on in your house or where the cat just jumped over something. Keeping that orientation for the students and for you becomes problematic. So I've learned to teach at a faster pace. I've learned to keep things going. In some ways, it's much more like a TV production, like a performance. And that is not always the case in a face-to-face classroom. And those skill sets are things that we need to learn, both as instructors and students. And the third, and I think I have saved the most important for last, is course design. Course design is, I think it is just it, and it is taking me a long time to revise my courses in ways that I take the student into consideration, give them the rigor without overloading my workload, giving them, not that I kill them and I'm fine, that's not what I mean, but the idea that they have the necessary rigor that is expected in these classes. So what I found in response to the question that was asked us about trauma is that you need to invite the students into the class. Now, this is not to say that we don't do this in face-to-face classes, but there is a different way that we invite the students into the class. You have to make them part of the class with you. Again, we do this in face-to-face, but I'm going to give you just an example of what I've learned. I divide my students into groups. One group this day, and I give them roles. On this particular day, Group A is going to lead the discussion, and the discussion topic is one of their choosing, within the topic framework of the class. The next group is going to further that discussion. So the next three have to take what's being said and they have to develop it and ask questions and learn how to do critical thinking and critical inquiry. And then the third group goes solo, one by one, and they demonstrate listening. Now, I have found that students really like that, and they rotate and they do, you know, three things: getting the students involved, getting them active, getting them with you. The barrier here is that listening is very difficult for students. And I'm sure that you will find that the same is in face-to-face, but online, again, because of the power dynamics, the orientation, all of that, listening becomes very, very problematic. So there is an issue with receiving the information that I have found in my students that is really important to work on. Another way to invite them into class is through options. So often when we have a face-to-face class, we really feel that we're together as a group, we're in sync, and we're just going through one thing after another. But in the online environment, and I've taught both asynchronously and synchronously, you don't know what your students are doing. They may have a 20-hour part-time job. They may have 2 children to deal with. You don't know. That may be I've had lots of working mothers. And so you don't know what their other life is like. So giving them options with deadlines and saying, you know, turn it in Thursday for these points, Sunday for these. I found that my students really like options. I created nano research assignments where they do 3 parts. One is data collection, the next one is data analysis, and the next one is an essay where they try to synthesize and bring it together. These small assignments are helpful because sometimes the student, the week just got away from them. They can only do this part. That's fine. They get some credit. They feel like they're still with me. Because in the online environment, a lot of students at the midpoint of the class, they go, uh-oh, well, there's no reason to work because there's no way I can do this. So the idea of keeping them inspired and keeping them going is really, really important. So the course design and I'm really glad that Anna said that about discovery, because that's what I have found. I know that sometimes our student evaluations tell us that we need to challenge our students, but I found that working in my area of the humanities in dance is that the students need self-discovery. They need to understand, they need to explore, they need to experiment. That's not always a challenge. It can be, and we can certainly understand it and argue for it in that sense, but it's not always a challenge. So another thing, a couple more things and I'm finished. What is possible, and I wanted to sort of twist this around because I think sometimes we're coming at these ideas in a way that privileges face-to-face over online. But what is possible in a virtual environment that is not possible in the face-to-face environment is a democratic one. I found that to be, you know, you cannot listen when you're in a face-to-face class, you cannot listen to every single student in your class, what they have to say on a question. They don't have to answer it. They can sort of skirt around. Other students with more vocal intent seem to take the stage. But in a virtual online class, every single student speaks in every single class. I can't think of anything that's more democratic than that. And I've had students tell me that they've developed a voice, that suddenly they're talking in other classes. For dancers, that's especially important as well. So with online asynchronous discussions, assignments with individual feedback, this can really achieve success for students. And what I found, to conclude, is that language and how it affects meaning is at the crux of what I believe that teaching online is about. And for me, language and meaning is the humanities. Thank you.
Cynthia, thank you so much. That was so powerful. I love so much about what was just said. And there was something that I wrote very, very big in my notes, which is now more than ever, we need strategies for inviting students into the classroom and letting them develop that voice. So thank you. I can't wait for Q&A. And now I'm going to pass the mic to Alex Avinia. Alex Avinia is an associate professor of Latin American history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. He previously taught at Florida State University. His book, Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside, was published by Oxford University Press in 2014 and was then awarded the Maria Elena Martinez Book Prize in Mexican History for 2015 by the Conference on Latin American History. His current research project explores the links between the political economy of narcotics, drug wars, and state violence in 1960s and 70s Mexico. So, Alex.
Thank you for the invitation to participate today. It's been amazing learning from both Anna and from DSO, taking notes as you both were speaking. So thank you for imparting your knowledge. There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. So that quote is from this famous Russian revolutionary of the early 20th century, but I feel like that was the overall sentiment in March when we made this transition from face-to-face courses to online. Decades happened in a matter of weeks, right? So, and having to deal with that, the pace and the intensity of that when teaching and in dealing with what students were experiencing ended up being my primary goal as we finished the previous spring semester. You know, the starting premise for when we were asked to restructure our classes in spring break of March to what I'm going to be doing in the fall is the following, is that we are asking students, faculty, and staff to return to classes in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of a virus with that's dangerous, that has high rates of lethality. It also in the midst of what Anna referred to as a social crisis, right? This ongoing cycle of rebellions in the United States. And I think for me as a teacher, it's really useful to center my pedagogy and to center what I'm trying to accomplish in my classroom as a historian in the material conditions in which my students are actually living in. So, you know, so the first thing that I'll say about, in response to some of the questions that Liz sent to us is that my class, I've always done this, but I think this current crisis really forced me to really try to get to know my audience, try to get to know my students, and try to be cognizant of those material conditions that they're actually experiencing, and then crafting my pedagogy around that.
Right.
I'm teaching an online class right now on the history of U.S. empire, and I had a student not turn in an assignment, a writing assignment, and I was able to see that on Canvas, and I reached out to the student and asked, what was going on, and they responded with, well, both of their parents were ill with COVID-19, and they were the responsible primary caretaker. That kind of outreach on my part, I think, is possibly the most important thing that we can do right now as professors and instructors. Learning what sort of challenges and obstacles that our students are currently facing, whether it's illness, whether it's taking care of ill parents, whether it's trying to balance working without adequate protections and balancing that with schoolwork, unemployment, the fact that we're being told to stay home, but there's very little or inexistent state support for being told to stay home and not work. All these, the broader context and these broader material conditions are what is guiding the way I structure my classes and the way that I'm trying to teach, the history of U.S. empire, the history of modern Mexico, which when I step back, it seems so trivial. Considering everything that's going on, these things seem trivial, but at the same time, I think, building off of the comments by Anna and by Cynthia, they can also be really productive, right? I think one of my teachers that's been really influential in terms of how I view teaching is Paulo Freire, right? This Brazilian critical pedagogist. And he has a great quote in which he says, our task as instructors should be to, quote, develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world with which and in which they find themselves, and to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process, in transformation. This moment of crisis, I think, allows us to do this even more clearly. And it's up to us in terms of how we structure the class, how we structure readings, how we structure assignments that help students place themselves within the current context and make critical connections with history, with cultural studies, with cultural theory, with dance, with film, with body studies, right? One of the things that I've done with my online classes that were previously face-to-face is to design class assignments that allow students to think about, really building off of Faulkner's famous quote about the past is never dead, it's not even past, right? So in my history of US empire class, one of the assignments was to do an op-ed, to write an opinion editorial about the current state of US empire, but having to marshal the historical knowledge that they gained throughout the course of the semester to then be able to write an 800 to 1,000 word op-ed that starts off with a strong lead sentence. And if they, and then I gave them extra credit if they actually submitted it to a newspaper, which for some of the students is actually kind of like a terrifying thing to think about. But that's the kind of connections that I've always tried to teach my students to make. But I think the current crisis, when so many things are happening at the same time, I think it's more important and more urgent than ever to have students engage what's going on now and using what the humanities can offer them in these classes in a productive, radical, transformative way. I think there's also certain questions that we need to think about. Maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. Speaking of material conditions, is like what's the purpose of the university now? Like, what is the purpose of the university in these times? What is questions about the material conditions that even make these things possible, like the platform we're on now? Like, what does it mean that we have this private company that has become extremely wealthy since March become the primary mode of delivering instruction? I think that not even from a security standpoint, right? There was a lot of the stuff about Zoom, about security that we read about early on when we made the transition. But there's a broader point to be made in terms of the relationship between a public higher ed education and its dependence or over-reliance on a private medium. And I think bringing those questions up now, but also even bringing up those questions within a classroom is really interesting. An online classroom, it's really interesting for students because they start to interrogate the very conditions that structure their everyday lives and that allow them to take classes, but at the same time also facing certain intractable obstacles and challenges that we should be helping them overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I wish that I could somehow scan my notes of what just happened and show everyone. I love everything, but I think this question, like moving into Q&A, what is the purpose of the university now? How is it more important and urgent that we bring the humanities and these questions into our classrooms to allow this moment in crisis to teach the moment of crisis? So thank you. And I'm just going to now unmute all of our speakers. And if there are any questions, I'll ask our moderators to pop them into chat. So now is the time, if you're watching this live stream, please comment on Facebook and YouTube. If you can't figure out how to do that, you can email me, but we'll have questions. But then while that's happening, I did have a question for all of our speakers, and I warned them a little bit that this was going to be coming. So some of them might have some opinions to share. As most everyone knows, we are moving to ASU's sync model for the fall. We are planning to be back in person in our classes. That's the plan for ASU right now. What are strategies and tactics for balancing student success and the realities of, I think, as Alex said, this moment of crisis that you might have? And I think Cynthia talked a little bit about this, so did Anna, so did Alex, right? Like, what are strategies?
If I could just say a few words, and also kind of building off of Alex's really powerful question at the end of his presentation about the purpose of the university. I think the university definitely has a purpose, and a purpose that is becoming more and more important, because right now we're inundated with information. We have I mean, you can access any kind of material that you want. We have various speakers on YouTube, on TV, on Facebook. We have bloggers. Everyone has something to say. But the university provides a kind of a structured environment where you can grow your own thoughts. And you can learn to filter out information that is not presented rigorously, that is not substantiated with claims. You can learn about the ways in which I mean, various images and words become inflammatory, and they sow division, and they are geared towards an emotional reaction instead of looking a little bit deeper, doing your own research to understand how things come to be the way they are. And the university provides tools to do all this, and it provides a mental space, a physical and a mental space where you can actually grow your own critical reasoning skills and open your horizons and learn about things that you didn't know that existed, or ways of approaching life in a way that you never thought about before. So what I wanted to say is that space essentially organizes our behavior. When we go to campus, when we drive to campus, in a way we leave our private life behind, and we enter into this professional world where we go to lectures, we go to a studies area in the library, or we go to a cafeteria, we see everyone on the computers, or we meet our friends and we chat about, life hacks or like strategies, how to succeed in this exam, or you learn about, a cool internship that someone did, or, a really interesting class that's going to be offered next semester. And this is a really a learning environment, and that is really is a space where you can mentally concentrate and invest in your own personal development, right? And basically, when we move online, or if we teach, if you find ourselves, learning from our homes, right? The private life begins to overwhelm our kind of that mental space, right? And so you have to find a way to to block off essentially space and time for you to think and to concentrate on what is important for you, and so block off distractions, turn off the social media, right? Block those apps, for example. Read the news if possible at the end of the day, not in the beginning of the morning, because otherwise you're going to spend your whole day thinking about what's happening, right? Or if you read the news, find a way to connect like what you're learning in the class to what, and write an op-ed piece, right? As the student in Alex's class, or my student in my graduate seminar. Just focus on the bigger picture, write down your goals, and block off that mental space and physical space. Talk to your loved ones about the necessity of those moments in the day where you'll be just by yourself, or you'll be just thinking about what is important right now for you.
I would like to offer in response to that online challenges physical presence. That's sort of what we're doing now. We're social distancing, but it challenges physical presence. And for dancers, where physical presence yields so much information, touch, and all of this is so vital to us to understand and process information. That is one of the main things for students I have found to get over. But again, I would encourage us to consider, with all these questions and ideas, that what can online do for us? What does it allow that face-to-face doesn't? And what I think it does is it makes visible what is often invisible in the face-to-face classroom. You see students at a greater depth. You're able to reach a greater depth of students because of all this individual interaction, which is, yes, work, but we're in a crisis. It's all work, So I think that again, I would offer that privileging face-to-face over online may not be our best strategy. Looking to see what online can do that you can't do. You can record classes. Students can go and see the class. They can go back over it. They can review their notes. There's all sorts of things that can happen. You can deal with a student individually and as Alex mentioned, reaching out. I found you have to reach out to students because they don't know exactly what to do. It's unfamiliar. So that reaching out can save so many students. And you learn so many things about your students that are impactful and impacting them. So I would offer us as a strategy that we begin to shift ourselves from thinking that there's only one way to deliver instruction in a university.
Alex, I don't want to cut you off if you have any thoughts in response to ASU Syncs before I go.
Yeah, just really quickly, I plan on emailing my students and I'm going to ask them what they think. I think we need the guiding principles for whether we should return to face-to-face in the fall, for me at least, at the individual level, will be empathy and solidarity. And I'm going to go, do what I can in terms of reaching out to students and asking them what they, what are they thinking? What are they feeling about going back to campus for face-to-face? What do they think about this ASU Sync model? And more or less, I'm going to let that and obviously like personal considerations, like with family, guide the type of decision that I will make, right? But there's also a lot of unanswered questions in terms of how this is going to play out. And again, we're asked, as I began my earlier presentation with, right? We're asking students to and staff and faculty to return back to campus in a very uncertain time, right? So, I mean, what the metric of success should be like people not dying, right? Like at that fundamental level. So how do we achieve that? And I think that remains an unresolved question that ongoing discussions about ASU Sync and even just a return to campus in general have, I think, at least in my perspective, answered or engaged in a satisfactory way.
Thank you, Alex.
From what I understood is that the ASU Sync option is a very flexible option for students and for faculty members as well. So anyone who has concerns about their own health or certain conditions or just is uncomfortable about coming to campus, they would not be asked to come to campus. All lectures will be recorded and made available. And so I think ASU is really trying to create, practical solutions for various scenarios. And I'm very grateful for these tools. But I also absolutely want to agree and underscore Alex's message that we need to reach out to students and to show empathy, solidarity, and to understand that not everyone's situation is the same. And it is our task as humanists, as scholars, as educators, is to help people find their own path through this crisis and still learn what they came to college for, and also to help them and support them in the best possible way.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask just a follow-up question on that, because something that I tracked throughout these responses, right, are what's important now is connection. What's important now, as Alex says, is empathy and solidarity, right? And I heard somewhere in there that we need to make this a new normal, right? And there's been a lot of talk over the past few months about what the new normal is going to look like across the globe. In Arizona, like it's going to look different in Phoenix than it will in other cities across the US. But if we could make connection and care, if we could imagine a world in which connection and care and empathy and solidarity was the new normal, then I think it looks a little bit like ASU Sync, but I think that there are other strategies such as emailing students and listening to them. We're teaching active listening, so we need to listen to students. And I wonder if there's anyone that wants to comment just a little bit on what other kind of new normal strategies we can employ, or that maybe you guys did encounter and have to adapt to over the spring or summer semesters as you were teaching. That was a very hard question.
I'll offer something. One of the questions that you emailed us, right? Like, what was your biggest fail? Like, more or less, my biggest fail was trying to lecture synchronously on Zoom for like more than 15 minutes. So what I came up with was, and part of this I learned in my like more my desire and my experience with more public facing work, is to learn to practice what I've learned doing podcasts. And I more or less set up my lectures as podcast lectures. And that allowed students to get away from the difficulty of synchronous Zoom lectures last spring semester. And it allowed them to listen to these podcast lectures when, within this span of a week, when they had time, when they, were doing who knows what, right? Like a number of different activities. Because one of the things that I really tried to accomplish was to just, and I always try to do this, but I think this crisis forced me to think about this more, is to restructure the class in a way where it's one giant collaborative study session more so than this typical class where you're working to get a grade individually. And so doing my lectures as podcasts and then having discussion board conversations, and then having like a voluntary Zoom seminar at the end of the week. Again, gave students the freedom and the flexibility to do what they could, considering the circumstances, but also trying to mitigate what Cynthia was bringing up about one of the values of online education was to completely undermine some of the power dynamics that exist in face-to-face settings. It doesn't matter, just by virtue of a professor being in that classroom, there's an inherent power dynamic physically. And I feel like this flexible way of just, setting up podcast lectures, setting up discussion boards, and then having like a Zoom seminar, voluntary Zoom seminar at the end of the week, worked to undermine some of that, and to encourage collaboration from my students. And one of the places where I saw this, like, actually, producing something really like interesting and for me, like, really satisfactory as a professor, was to see my students on like social media talking about it. They would tag me like on Twitter, but to me that was evidence that like something happened and they went beyond what was required of them because they were really interested, right? So in addition to everything I just described, I would always also put like a further reading or further research section. And it was amazing to me how many students actually followed up and actually explored assignments or suggestions that were not required reading or required watching or viewing.
I would have to agree with Alex. That goes with my options. And from the student's perspective, they may have hours of classes. Well, we all know how much exhaustion and fatigue comes to us from sitting in and doing this type of engagement, and there is a almost a heightened awareness when you're doing this, because there's a performative value to it. There's a performance that you're doing. You're performing yourself in a different way again, and so that in and of itself raises your level of engagement, even though your students may not be that. But if they're having 4-6 hours of this, it's quite a lot. So Alex's options in terms of allowing them to listen to podcasts, I think is just wonderful. And one strategy for our new normal might be to consider the student's point of view. It's sometimes it's not that a student doesn't want to accomplish the goals that you set forth, it's that they can't. And sometimes students do not tell you that. And you don't find out until their success is really diminished unless you do that type of outreach. So I think options are really, really important. And then I just want to speak to what Celine has written here about emotional labor and our own wellness. I once did, when I started out, again, one of my failings, I thought they're going to be rigorous. Nobody's going to tell me that online is not as good as face-to-face. I'm going to give my students assignments. And so I tallied up, because I was exhausted in December. So I tallied up everything that I had done, all the assignments week by week that I was looking at. I was looking at like 1,000 pieces of text and information. I mean, I thought to myself, what did I do? And you did this to yourself because you created this. So again, it's this idea of course design, of honing your assignments so that the student has enough rigor and finds things out. It's that discovery that Anna was talking about. They need to self-discover. So how do you create environments for learning that allow them to discover for themselves? Much more powerful than you telling them. That's my offering.
And I'll just briefly read this comment that we have. It's a question that someone posed. Are there any tips for handling the emotional labor and one's own wellness while tending to students and ourselves as humans? And Cynthia, thank you for your response. I wonder if Anna and Alex have any responses.
Yes, I think that this is such an important question because like we cannot provide to give our full to our students and to our families or to our communities if we don't take care of ourselves. And burnout is really, really real, and that emotional toll that I mean, dealing with all these anxieties of what's happening right now, it's really is there. And there is a physical fatigue as well, because I mean, just from my personal experience, I did not have a desk. Like when we transitioned to online, a desk that would be actually private, and I ended up with like a crippled back because like I was, I mean, just facing my laptop like this all day long. So what I realized is that taking a moment to breathe and I mean, just have this media detox, just like every day is so essential. Just, I mean, turn off your phone, turn off your computer, turn off the internet, and going for a walk. Just, I mean, just trying to clear your mind this way, this physical movement and the sunshine, it actually helps. Or doing yoga, or doing a little bit of your hobby, if you have one, playing music or drawing or doing mosaics, or I don't know, like something that brings you joy and just can take your mind off a little bit. It may seems like a waste of time, but it's not. Your body and your mind needs to replenish its resources, and then you would be able to, you know, make a difference in the world if you take care first of yourself as well.
I think what helped me was just trying to have a very structured system for the day. Like I said, like I devote these hours to teaching and these hours for research or whatever. But I also have 2 young kids at home, so they more or less were like the enforcers of my schedule. So in the end, like they were the best self-care advocates that I have, right? Because I think my tendency and the tendency for many professors is to burn out, right? And this is one of the interesting conversations that I saw online beginning with the lockdowns is, you know, how to be productive in the age of COVID-19. And it's kind of an insane question to think about in terms of how can you be productive, or why should you be productive in the era of COVID-19. So I really tried to devote the energy that I did have, considering I had children at home away from their school. It was to my teaching, and to have a structure around what hours of the day I was going to devote to my students, to creating and uploading the podcast lectures, and responding to emails. And then once a certain time came up, I had my 2 little enforcers who would come and grab me and say, okay, you're done. And in the end, that's what's helped me emotionally most of all.
Yeah, I have a 6-year-old too who was out of school, obviously, and I think he really enjoyed. Like he would sometimes pop up, watch me through the door, talk to my students, and then he said, I want to record a lecture too. And we actually set up a Zoom for him, and he recorded his own presentation about things that he's interested in. He's interested in space. So I think the kids are also basically, I mean, this is changing their lives as well. And they're witnessing us, changing our life and working and, balancing things, and they're learning from that as well. so we also could role model for our kids and just create this kind of structured environment. And I also absolutely agree with Alex about the necessity of having a structure in your timeline during the day. I'm writing down the chores that I have to do, along with the emails that I have to respond, along with the things that I have to do for teaching and for my research on the same list, so that I see what do I need to do today or next day. And that somehow also helps to organize a little bit.
Thank you all for that. And now we are almost out of time, so I want to invite y'all to give maybe one final thought. And I will prompt that a little bit by saying some of the things that I got from this amazing conversation, which is I love this idea of thinking about teaching online as a performance. Alex, thank you so much for sharing lectures as podcasts. I think that's something that's really going to shape the way that I think about lecturing online for a really long time. We talked a lot about what asynchronous options for students look like, what listening to students, actively reaching out and then actively listening to students looks like, providing them options for and structuring options within lesson plans, and then the need for us to allow and enable students to make self-discoveries, to self-discover is very important. And then I think we ended with a really good point, which is we need to take care of ourselves to take care of others. And I think that that's something that maybe all of us need to hear right now. So thank you for sharing how you guys are doing that. And I think ending on this emphasis of empathy and solidarity and care is really great, with looking towards the rest of the things in our series and maybe looking towards final comments from our speakers today. So anyone that would like to go.
I'll start. I think for me, one of the things that happened and occurred when we had 3 days and everybody went online, I was already there, but I was busy helping everyone, was this connectivity and the need to care for my colleagues and help them through and answer their questions and meet with them a couple different times and doing that. But I must say that I am so pleased that we all did this. It's kind of like your decade in a week, Alex. I was really pleased that we all did this, because I am so certain that as humanities, as humanities scholars, humanities enthusiasts, and that we need to be part of this online revolution. I'm sorry that it took COVID to get us here. I certainly didn't want to say, we needed a pandemic, but what I'm saying is that this is an enormous opportunity. It's a time in when we can be creative, when we can ask for new tools, when we can find new ways in which technology can serve us. For a long time, the online environment, I have felt, has been much easier for sciences, because the tools that they have, everything seemed to help that type of learning sometimes. Not labs, but learning that needed to be done, important learning. But the hermeneutical, interpretive, making meaning, understanding, self-discovery, we may need new tools. We may need we need our creativity, and we need to be part of this discussion so that we can also push forward what is needed to be a human in the online environment.
Yes, this is really a powerful and very inspiring message. And likewise, I just also want to say that the teaching online has taught me a lot and brought me a lot closer to my students. And also, like Alex has already said, it made, or maybe it was Cynthia, but made invisible things visible, and it maybe allowed for us to make better connections between very powerful readings, whether for fiction or theoretical works that we're analyzing, and our own condition, and recognize like who we are right now in this moment, and how our life in society, how they are organized, right? So I think I mean, the university is that kind of space where this rigorous and creative and imaginative work is happening and will be happening in the future.
I really appreciate both the comments and the insight that both Cynthia and Anna provided, and I've learned a lot today. I agree with what Cynthia brought up about online education, and I would push it even a little further and say the promise of online education intensifies if, and I guess I'm like the materialist, I'm gonna keep harping on this, but if we also think about the material conditions that enable online education, like if it's faculty who are in control of the mediums and the technology, right? If faculty and staff and university officials are the ones who are able to structure what this technology looks like and what this delivery looks like, and not entities who may have conflicting incentives for what they're doing, then I think that's when we can reach potentially the most radical potential of online education, right? And I think so there's some questions that need to be asked about that, and there's you know, a lot of work that remains to be done in that arena. I think we had a former colleague at ASU, Dr. Penelope Moon, who in my school helped more or less design and run our online education program for a while, and she's at another university now, but that's in her writings in like the Chronicle of Higher Ed or Higher Ed Journal. She continues to consistently emphasizes that point, is that online does have a certain radical potential, but it needs to be in the power of those who are actually teaching and delivering the classes, and not outside entities that may be driven by other incentives.
Well, thank you. And with that, I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. We have radical potential for online education, and we need to get it in the hands of the people that are teaching, that are actually teaching, that are doing education. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you everyone that's watching on the live stream. I so appreciate your time. The Institute for Humanities Research is running a series of these events. The next one will be on June 30th, and that will be Research Online in the Age of Coronavirus. I hope that you're able to join us then. And for now, I will say thank you again. I'm grateful. Everyone have a wonderful Tuesday.
Thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you.